The courtroom smells like wood polish and old air, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists when something important is about to happen. Rudy Baines sits at the defense table and does not move. He is 6'2" and built the way men get built when they have spent their lives doing physical work, not in a gym, not for appearance, but because the work required it and the body adapted. His shoulders fill the back of the chair. His hands folded on the table in front of him are large and scarred in the specific way of someone who has spent decades around engines and metal and things that cut. The tattoos on his forearms have faded with time, the way all things fade when exposed to enough years of sun and labor and the slow erosion of a life that kept moving. Wings, flames, a name he does not say out loud anymore. The remnants of a world he belonged to once and left behind at 24 and has been paying the exit fee on ever since. He is 46 years old. He stares at the wood paneling on the wall opposite the defense table. Not at the jury, not at the prosecutor in his expensive suit who has spent the last 2 days telling 12 people in careful measured language that Rudy Baines is exactly what he looks like. Not at the gallery behind him where he knows without turning that 2 people are sitting in the second row with the specific stillness of people who have learned through long practice to hold themselves together in rooms like this one. He stares at the wood paneling. He has learned in this course of a life that has taken him through county lockups and chapter meetings, in hospital waiting rooms, in school auditoriums, and 100 other places where a man like him was not expected and not entirely welcome, that the best thing he can do in any room is give people as little as possible to work with. No expression means no ammunition, no movement means no tell. He learned this young, and it became a habit, and the habit became a kind of armor. And now sitting in a courtroom in Odessa, Texas, being tried for a murder he did not commit. The armor is the only thing between him and the thing underneath it, which is not fear exactly, but is something adjacent to fear, something he has no clean word for. The attorney at his left stands up. Jerome Baines is 28 years old. He is wearing a charcoal gray suit that fits him exactly right, the kind of fit that does not happen by accident, but by attention and intention, and a particular understanding of how the world reads a man before he opens his mouth. His posture is perfect in the specific way of someone who has spent years studying how to be taken seriously in rooms that were not built with him in mind. He is organized and precise and has a quality of stillness in argument that unnerves opposing counsel because it looks like calm and is actually something more like controlled power. He is also, in ways that defy the standard categories the world uses for such things, Rudy's son. Jerome places both hands flat on the defense table for a moment. Then he turns to face the jury. Rudy does not turn to watch him. He keeps his eyes on the wood paneling, but he hears every word. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jerome says. His voice is level. It does not perform. "The man I am defending today raised me. He raised my sister. He had no reason to do either of those things. Nobody asked him to. Nobody sent him. He showed up on his own and he stayed. And for 19 years through everything, he never once asked to be thanked." Rudy stares at the wall. He thinks do not show them anything. He thinks 19 years. He thinks about a street in Odessa at 2 in the morning and the way fire looks when it is eating a building from the inside out and 2 small figures standing on the sidewalk in the dark. It was October 2005. Rudy had been at a chapter meeting that ran late the way they always ran late because someone always had something to say and someone else always had something to argue. And the meetings that were supposed to end at 10 never ended before midnight. He was not a full patch member. He was what the club called an associate, which meant he was close enough to understand how things worked and far enough that certain conversations stopped when he walked in the room. He had been in that position for 5 years and was beginning to understand in the slow way that real understanding comes that he was not going to move further in and was not yet ready to move out and was living in the uncomfortable middle of a life that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. He was driving home on Crane Street because Crane Street was the fastest route from the chapter house to his apartment above the garage on Millard. And he was tired in the bone-deep way that comes from sitting in a room with too many opinions for too long, and he was thinking about nothing in particular when he saw the light. Not street light, not porch light, the light that comes from a structure burning. He pulled over without thinking about it. He got out of the truck without thinking about it. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house at 417 Crane Street and understood within the first 30 seconds that it was beyond saving. The fire was already in the walls, already in the roof, already in the spaces between things where fire goes when it wants to stay. The neighbors had called 911. He could hear the sirens in the distance, still several minutes away. He saw the two children. They were standing at the far edge of the yard near the street, pressed against each other, with the specific closeness of people who are frightened and have nothing else to hold on to. The boy was older. He was holding the girl by the hand, and she was pressed against his side, and neither of them was making a sound that Rudy could hear over the noise of the fire. The boy was wearing a t-shirt and jeans. The girl was in pajamas. They were both in bare feet. Rudy walked over to them. He did not know what he was going to say. He did not plan anything. He simply walked over and crouched down, so he was at their level, which was something he did not usually think to do, and did not know why he thought of it then, and he looked at them. The boy looked back. His eyes were dry. He was past crying already in the place that comes after the first shock, the place where the body has stopped responding with tears and started responding with something quieter and harder. His hands were shaking, but his face was still. "Are you hurt?" Rudy said. "No," the boy said. "Is there anyone else in there?" The boy looked at the house. He looked at it for a long moment. "Our mom and dad," he said. Rudy looked at the house. He stayed with them on the sidewalk until the fire trucks came, until the paramedics came, until the woman from Child Protective Services came and kneeled down in her good slacks on the dirty sidewalk and spoke to them in a quiet, professional voice about what was going to happen next. He stayed until someone asked him if he was a neighbor, and he said, "No, I was just driving by." He gave his name and number to the officer who asked for them. Then he got in his truck and drove home. He did not sleep. He sat in the single chair in his apartment above the garage and thought about two children standing in bare feet on a cold sidewalk in October, watching everything burn. In the morning, he called in sick to the shop where he did mechanic work. He called the number the caseworker had given him. He asked where the children were being placed. The caseworker was cautious in the way caseworkers are trained to be, which is to say she told him almost nothing while sounding like she was being helpful. He asked if he could visit. She told him the children were in temporary placement and that the situation was being evaluated and that she would note his interest. He went to the shelter anyway. He found it the way he found most things, by being persistent in the specific, quiet way that does not give people a reason to push back. He sat in the waiting room on a plastic chair for 2 hours before the woman at the desk agreed to let the children know someone wanted to see them. The boy came into the waiting room with the girl behind him, one hand on her shoulder, positioned in the way of someone who has appointed himself the protector of something and is not going to be talked out of it. He looked at Rudy for a long moment. Rudy said, "I was there, the other night on Crane Street. I sat with you on the sidewalk until the paramedics came." The boy kept looking at him. "I hear you two don't have a place," Rudy said. The boy said, "We have a place. They said we might have to go to different places." Rudy said, "I've got a place. It's 1 bedroom. It's above a garage. It's not much, but it's real and it's yours if you want it." The girl looked at the boy. The boy looked at Rudy. "You look scary," the boy said. Rudy said, "Yeah, I know." The boy thought about this for a moment. He had the face of a child who has recently had the world rearranged under him and is working out how to stand on the new arrangement. He looked at his sister. She looked back at him with eyes that said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you," because she had already understood at 7 years old that he was the fixed point around which things could be organized. The boy said, "What's your name?" "Rudy Baines," Rudy said. "People call me Rye." The boy said, "I'm Jerome. This is Adele." Rudy nodded. Jerome said, "Okay." That was it. That was the whole conversation. They left with him that afternoon. The caseworker, a woman named Beverly Oakes, who had seen enough of the system to be skeptical of most things and had nevertheless spent enough years in it to know that the perfect placement was a fiction and the real work was making the available placement work, came to the apartment twice in the first 2 weeks. She walked through the rooms with a clipboard and wrote things down in a way that made Rudy's jaw tighten. He answered everything. He showed her the bunk bed he had borrowed from a man he knew at the shop. He showed her the school enrollment forms he had started filling out. He showed her the refrigerator. After the second visit, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at him across it. You understand this is going to take time, she said. Background checks, home assessments. The children's welfare has to be the primary consideration. Rudy said, that's also my primary consideration. She wrote something on her clipboard. He could not read what it was. After she left, Jerome came out of the bedroom. He had been doing homework at the small desk Rudy had set up for him there, which was actually a TV tray with a stable surface that Rudy had found at a yard sale and carried home in the bed of his truck because it was the right height for a 9-year-old. Is she going to take us back? Jerome said. I don't know, Rudy said. But I'm going to make it harder for them too. He meant that. He enrolled them in school the next morning. He took a second job doing oil changes on weekends. He called in favors from people he would normally have avoided to get a proper kitchen table and a space heater and a set of winter coats in the right sizes. He learned which bus got Jerome to school fastest. He learned that Adele was afraid of the dark in the specific way of a child who has recently discovered that terrifying things can happen even in places that are supposed to be safe. He started leaving a light on in the hallway. He learned that Jerome, when he was stressed or processing something difficult, went very quiet in a particular way, not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone who was holding everything inside and working through it alone. Rudy recognized this quality because he had it himself. He did not know what to do about it. He left Jerome alone when he needed it and made sure food was on the table when he came out the other side. He learned that Adele started coughing that winter in a way that did not go away. The cough was not alarming at first. Children get sick in winter. But it came back after she got better and came back again after the second time, and by early spring, it had developed a quality, a particular wet catch at the end of each exhale that sent him to the county clinic with her on a Thursday afternoon. The wait was 4 hours. The doctor who saw them was rushed in the way of a doctor who has more patience than ours and has learned to triage everything. He listened to Adele's chest, asked about her history, wrote a prescription for an inhaler, and sent them home. He said it was probably reactive airway disease, likely triggered by smoke exposure. He said the inhaler would help. The inhaler helped somewhat. Then it helped less. Then over the next several years, the pattern established itself: better, worse, a chronic negotiation with lungs that had been damaged before she had any say in the matter, by smoke and cold, and years of substandard housing that she had not chosen and could not leave. Rudy took her to every appointment. He fought with insurance. He argued with intake workers. He learned the difference between an albuterol inhaler and a corticosteroid inhaler, and when each was supposed to be used because the clinic changed doctors twice, and the new doctors kept starting from scratch. And the only person who maintained continuity of information about Adele's lungs was him. Jerome watched all of it. He watched the way a child watches when he has already learned that adults are unreliable and is in the process of revising that assessment based on new evidence. He watched Rudy at the kitchen table with the insurance forms. He watched Rudy on the phone arguing in the flat, controlled voice that Rudy used when he was most serious about something. He watched Rudy come back from the overnight shift at the shop, still in his work clothes, and make scrambled eggs because it was the fastest thing and they needed to eat before school. He did not say anything about what he was observing. He just stopped being ready to run. This took about a year. Rudy noticed when it happened, not because Jerome did anything dramatically different, but because the particular quality of watchfulness changed. The readiness for disaster dialed down a few degrees. Jerome started doing his homework at the kitchen table instead of in the bedroom. He started asking questions about things that were not directly related to immediate survival. He asked Rudy once, while they were both watching a nature program about birds, why some birds migrated and others didn't. Rudy said he supposed the ones that stayed had found something worth staying for. Jerome thought about this for a while and then went back to watching the television. The neighbors on the block were polite in the specific way of people who have made a decision about something and are too reserved to say it out loud. They smiled when they had to. They said hello at the mailbox. They went inside and thought their own thoughts. A woman 2 houses down called CPS in the first year. She cited vague concerns. Another neighbor mentioned to someone at the school that the living situation seemed irregular. Both times Beverly Oaks came, walked through the apartment, asked her questions, and found nothing actionable. At school, Jerome and Adele were asked with some regularity and without much delicacy about their living situation. Adele developed a way of answering that deflected without lying. Jerome developed a different approach. By the time he was in fourth grade, when a well-meaning teacher named Mr. Aldrich pulled him aside and said with genuine concern that he could always talk to someone, if things were difficult at home, Jerome looked at him steadily and said, "Things are okay at home." The thing Jerome would think about later when he was old enough to understand how strange it was that he mostly meant it. Rudy was not warm in the way the word warmth usually implies. He did not hug easily. He did not say, "I love you," not then, not yet. He was not built for the vocabulary of feeling and did not pretend to be. What he was built for was showing up, and he showed up with a consistency that was so absolute it eventually became the ground under their feet, the thing they stood on without having to think about it. School plays, sick nights, court dates for paperwork, appointments with insurance companies about Adele's medication, all of it every time, no exceptions. When Jerome was 11, he came down with a strep infection that went untreated too long because the clinic's scheduling system had lost his follow-up appointment and nobody had called to reschedule. The infection progressed. He was hospitalized for 4 days. When he came home thin and exhausted and with an antibiotic prescription that cost more than Rudy cleared in a week, CPS opened a formal investigation. A caseworker named Torres filed an initial report citing incomplete medical records and recommending further investigation for possible neglect. The investigation was assigned to a senior worker. Rudy was interviewed twice. The children were interviewed separately. The workers went through the apartment, again more carefully this time. Rudy sat through all of it with the stillness he had developed over years of being in rooms where someone was trying to determine whether he was the problem. 6 weeks later, the investigation closed in his favor. The findings stated that the child's medical history reflected systemic gaps in access to care, not guardian misconduct. Beverly Oakes, who had been called as a supporting reference, told them what she had observed over 2 years of follow-up visits, and her professional opinion was unambiguous. The investigation closed. Rudy did not throw away the file. He kept it in a cardboard box in the back of the hallway closet behind a shelf of old motor manuals and a winter jacket from 3 seasons ago. He added to it occasionally medical forms and school documents and the paperwork trail of a life being built from not much into something real. Inside the file, tucked into the back cover, was a single sheet of paper he had written at the kitchen table during the worst week of the investigation, when he had genuinely believed that the outcome was going to go the other way. The handwriting was blocky and slightly slanted, functional rather than elegant, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a system that did not prioritize penmanship. If they move forward with removal, he had written, "I will take the neglect charge. Contact Beverly Oakes. Do not let them separate the kids." He had been prepared to accept a legal finding against himself, to put himself in a position that would follow him on paper for years. If that was the price of keeping Jerome and Adele together, he had calculated the trade and decided it was worth making. The investigation closed before he had to make that call. He folded the note back into the file and put the file in the box and put the box behind the motor manuals. He did not tell Jerome or Adele about any of it. Jerome graduated high school third in his class. He won a partial scholarship to the State University in Austin. Rudy loaded his truck, which needed new shocks in a way that made the highway feel like a conversation, and drove him 6 hours to campus. They talked about almost nothing for most of the drive, which was how they talked about the most important things. When they unloaded the truck in the dormitory parking lot, Rudy stood for a moment looking at the campus in the late afternoon light, the old buildings and the oak trees and the students moving between them with the particular ease of people who have been told their whole lives that places like this are meant for them. He said, "Don't let them shrink you." Jerome looked at him. Rudy said, "All the degrees and the titles and the offices, they'll make you feel smaller than you are." "You're not." Jerome kept looking at him. Rudy picked up the last box from the bed of the truck. He said, "I'm serious." He drove back alone. He called once a week. He never missed. Jerome studied pre-law. He was one of 7 black students in his graduating class. He graduated with honors and a specific focused understanding of how systems work and who they are built to protect, an understanding he had been developing since he was 9 years old, watching Rudy argue with an insurance company on the kitchen phone. He got into law school on a merit scholarship. He specialized in criminal defense. He told people it was because he believed in the right to representation, which was true and also not the whole truth. The part he did not usually add was that he had grown up watching someone he loved navigate a system designed to assume the worst of him, and he had decided that the person in that room who pushed back was the person he wanted to be. He graduated law school, he took a position at a firm in San Antonio. He was building something real. In 2022, Rudy was doing what he had always done, which was working, keeping to himself and paying attention to things other people missed. He was at the county records office for an unrelated matter, something to do with a title question on a property a friend of his from the shop was trying to buy, when he found himself waiting for a clerk and standing next to the shelf of property transfer records for the period 2001 through 2006. He did not intend to look. He was not looking for anything specific. He pulled the bound volume for 2004 because it was closest to hand and he had nothing else to do while he waited, and he opened it to a random page and he saw the name. Carl Pruitt, Property Management, filing for 417 Crane Street, dated March 2004. Signature on file for electrical inspection and maintenance confirmation. Rudy stood very still. He looked at the name for a long time. Then he asked the clerk to make him a copy. He spent the next 3 weekends at the records office going through microfilm. He was methodical about it the way he was methodical about everything. Mechanical, working from the outside in toward the center of the problem. What he found was this: Carl Pruitt, from 2001 through the fall of 2005, had been the property manager for a man named Frank Denham, who owned 14 rental properties across Odessa, including the house at 417 Crane Street. During that period, Pruitt had signed off on 3 separate maintenance inspection reports for the electrical system at 417 Crane, each confirming that the cited violations had been corrected. The violations had not been corrected. The aluminum wiring had never been replaced. The work had been documented on paper and nowhere else. Rudy sat in the microfilm room with the copies spread on the table in front of him and thought about a building burning from the inside out. He thought about Jerome and Adele on the sidewalk in bare feet. He thought about the caseworker kneeling in her good slacks. He thought about 2 people who did not make it out of the building because old aluminum wiring in the walls had been cited 3 times, and 3 times the paperwork had been filed and the work had not been done. He thought about Carl Pruitt, whom he had known from the chapter years. Pruitt had been older, harder, the kind of man who treated other people's problems as opportunities to position himself advantageously. Rudy had known him well enough to understand exactly what kind of person he was, and had spent most of his late 20s and early 30s working to put distance between himself and that orbit. He drove home with the copies folded in his jacket pocket. He did not tell Jerome. He told himself it was because Jerome was building something real, a career, a reputation, a life, and he did not want to drag him backward into the wreckage of a night that was 19 years old. He told himself it was because there was nothing actionable, no clear crime with a clear remedy, just a paper trail that explained how 2 people had died and who had signed the forms that allowed it to happen. He told himself that knowing would not give Jerome or Adele anything except pain. He told himself a lot of things that were partly true and did not quite add up to the whole truth, which was that he was protecting them the only way he knew how, which was to put himself between them and the thing that could hurt them without telling them it was there. He kept the copies in the box in the closet, behind the motor manuals, next to the folder with the note. 2 years passed, then Carl Pruitt sent a letter to Jerome's office in San Antonio. It was not signed with his name. It was addressed to Jerome Bain's attorney at law, and it referred in vague but specific terms to old business, from Rudy's time with the Hells Angels chapter in Odessa, and it suggested that certain information about that period, information that would affect Jerome's professional reputation and potentially his bar standing, could become public, unless Rudy made certain arrangements. Jerome forwarded it to Rudy without comment, with a single line attached. "Do you know what this is about?" Rudy read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October 2023. He sat with it for a long time. He thought about Jerome at 9 years old sitting across from him in a shelter waiting room. He thought about the scholarship letter. He thought about the charcoal suit and the perfect posture and the career that had been built out of nothing but will and intelligence, and 19 years of a foundation that Rudy had tried to make solid enough to build on. He thought about what it meant that Pruitt was reaching toward that. He folded the letter. He put it in his jacket pocket. He drove to Odessa. He found Pruitt at the bar in Wheeler Street where Pruitt had been drinking since before Rudy had known him. He sat down across from him in a booth in the back. He told Pruitt what he thought of him in specific terms that covered both the letter and the forms Pruitt had signed for 417 Crane Street. He was thorough. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anything, not explicitly. He said what he had come to say, and he let Pruitt understand from the way it was said that there were no arrangements to be made and no further communication was going to be welcomed. Pruitt laughed. He said, "It's a rental property, Rye. Nobody put a gun to their heads." Rudy looked at him across the booth for a moment. Then he stood up and walked out. He was in his truck and driving by 10:15. He had 3 people he could name who could confirm his location between 10:30 and midnight. Nobody had ever asked them. 6 days later, Carl Pruitt was found shot in a drainage ditch outside of Odessa. Wallet intact. Phone missing. Truck parked a quarter-mile away with the keys in the ignition. Parked a quarter-mile. Rudy's name was in Pruitt's phone records. 2 calls in the week before his death. A witness named Roy Casper stated he had seen a truck matching Rudy's near the site on the night in question. A partial fingerprint found on the exterior of the truck's passenger door handle was consistent with Rudy's prints, though not conclusive. They arrested him on a Thursday. The call came at 6:14 in the evening. Jerome picked up and Rudy said, "I need you to not panic. There is something I have to explain. Just come." Now Jerome stands in front of a jury in Odessa, Texas, and Rudy sits at the defense table and stares at the wood paneling and thinks about all the things he did not say and all the things he did instead and whether the sum of it adds up to something that resembles the right answer. The opening statement ends. Jerome sits back down beside him. He does not say anything. He opens a folder on the table in front of him and reviews documents he has already reviewed a dozen times with the focused attention of someone who works by going over things until they stop yielding new information and then going over them again. Rudy looks at Jerome's hands on the documents. He thinks about the night in the shelter, the plastic chairs, the boy who said you look scary and then went home with him anyway because the alternative was being separated from his sister, and a 9-year-old calculating the odds in real time had decided that the big man with the faded tattoos was the better bet. 19 years. That afternoon, during the recess that follows the first session of testimony, a guard escorts Rudy to the small holding room where attorneys are permitted to meet with clients. Jerome comes in with his briefcase. He sets it on the table. He opens it and removes a single sheet of paper and places it in front of Rudy. It is the fingerprint analysis report. Jerome sits down across from him and says, "The print is on the exterior passenger handle, not the driver's side, not the steering wheel, not the gear shift, the exterior passenger handle." Rudy looks at the paper. Jerome says, "You always open the passenger door for people getting in. Every time you picked me up from school. Every time we went anywhere. You opened the door first, and then you went around to the driver's side. I watched you do it for 19 years. Rudy is quiet. Jerome says, "You opened the door for him. You drove him somewhere or you got in the truck with him at some point that night. That's what this print says. Not what they're telling the jury it says. The room is quiet. The fluorescent lights hum, the way fluorescent lights hum in rooms like this, a tuneless, constant frequency that becomes the silence underneath all conversation." Rudy looks at the fingerprint analysis report for a long moment. Then he looks up at Jerome. In 19 years of raising this man, Rudy has shown Jerome almost nothing of what happens inside him. He has been methodical and present and reliable and closed in the way that men of a certain generation are closed, the way that certain kinds of lives teach a man to be closed, the way armor becomes so familiar that you stop being aware of wearing it. But Jerome has been watching him for 19 years. Jerome sees it. For one unguarded moment, sitting across a metal table in a fluorescent-lit holding room in Odessa, Texas, the armor comes off. Not all the way, not in any dramatic or visible fashion, but enough for Jerome to see what is underneath it. Not fear for himself, not panic about the trial or the charge or the 14 years in federal prison that constitute the maximum sentence for first-degree murder in Texas. Fear for Jerome. The specific bone-level fear of a man who has spent 19 years making sure a particular person was going to be all right, who has built and maintained and protected that particular person's all rightness at considerable personal cost for nearly 2 decades. and who is now sitting in a room understanding clearly for the first time that this situation, the one he has put himself in through his own choices and his own silences, in his own particular way of protecting people, might actually cost them both something real. Jerome looks at him across the table. He does not look away. He picks up the fingerprint analysis report and puts it back in his briefcase and snaps it closed and stands up. There is more, he says. I'll be back tomorrow. Rudy nods. Jerome goes to the door and waits for the guard. At the threshold, he stops and turns back. He looks at Rudy one more time with the eyes of a man who has been watching the same person for 19 years and knows exactly what he's looking at. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't have to. He goes. Rudy sits alone in the holding room with the fluorescent lights humming and thinks about a street in October and two children in bare feet and a door he walked through 19 years ago that he has never regretted walking through, not for a single day, not once. He thinks about a note folded in a box behind a shelf of motor manuals. He thinks about 19 years of phone calls, one every week, no exceptions. He thinks about a 6-hour drive in a truck that needed new shocks. He thinks about the wood paneling in the courtroom and the way Jerome looks standing in front of the jury in his charcoal suit with his perfect posture and his controlled, precise voice defending the man who raised him in a room full of people who have already decided what that man is. The guard comes to tell him time is up. Rudy stands. He folds his hands. He walks back to the holding cell and sits down and does not show the walls anything either. Outside in the corridor, Jerome Baines is already on his phone, already working, already moving through the documents in his mind toward the next thing and the thing after that, building the case. The way he builds everything piece by piece with the methodical care of a man who learned early that the world does not give you anything. It is not made to give, and that making it give you something else requires patience and precision and the willingness to keep going when the next step is not yet visible. He did not choose Rudy. He was 9 years old in a shelter waiting room, and a stranger sat down across from him and made him an offer, and he waited with the cold, practical intelligence of a child who has recently lost everything and has nothing left to protect except his sister, and he decided the offer was the better bet. But there is a difference between not choosing something and not being grateful for it. Jerome Baines has known this difference for 19 years. He walks down the corridor toward the exit in the parking lot and the work waiting to be done, and somewhere inside the charcoal suit and the perfect posture and the controlled legal mind he carries with him, the boy who said you look scary to a stranger in a waiting room and went home with him anyway. That boy is why he is here. That man is why he became who he is. The corridor is long and the light is the wrong kind, and it smells like industrial cleaner and old carpet, the same smell it has always had, the same smell that will probably outlast all of them. Jerome pushes through the door into the October air and gets to work. The holding cell is 8 feet by 10 feet. Rudy knows this because he has measured it the way he measures everything unfamiliar, by walking it, by standing in different corners, and looking at the room from different angles until the dimensions become something his body understands rather than just his eyes. 8 feet by 10 feet. A cot with a mattress that is thinner than it should be. A metal toilet, a metal sink, a shelf bolted to the wall at a height that is comfortable for no one in particular. The fluorescent light overhead buzzes at a frequency that sits just at the edge of audibility, present enough to be aware of, not loud enough to complain about. He has been in rooms like this before, not for this, not for anything close to this, but he knows the grammar of these rooms, the way they are designed to reduce a person to the minimum, to strip away the things that make a man feel like a man, the space and the light and the ability to choose when to be alone and when not to be. He knows how to be in a room like this without letting it do what it is designed to do. He lies on the cot with his hands folded on his chest and stares at the ceiling and thinks. He has been in custody for 11 months. The trial started 3 weeks ago. Jerome visits every day, sometimes twice. Adele comes on weekends. They bring documents, questions, updates on the investigation that Jerome is running parallel to the trial with the particular organized intensity of someone who cannot afford to let either thread drop. Rudy reads everything they bring him. He asks questions when something is unclear. He answers their questions as completely as he can, which is not the same as completely, and Jerome knows it and has not yet pushed all the way to the center of it because there is an order to these things and they are not there yet. But they are getting there, He knows Jerome found something yesterday by the way Jerome looked at him before he left. Not the expression itself, which was the same controlled professional mask Jerome wore in all professional situations, but something underneath it. A quality of stillness that was different from Jerome's usual stillness. The stillness of someone who has found a piece that changes the shape of what the picture is becoming. Rudy stares at the ceiling. He thinks about 2022, about standing in the county records office with a bound volume open in his hands and a name on a property filing that he had not been looking for and had found anyway the way you find certain things, not because you were searching, but because you were in the right place with enough knowledge to recognize what you were looking at. Carl Pruitt, March 2004, 417 Crane Street. He had known Pruitt from the chapter years. Not a close association, not a friendship, not anything that could be called trust. Pruitt was the kind of man who existed in a particular orbit of the Hells Angels world, not a full patch member, but present enough at the margins to be useful when certain things needed doing, and deniable when they did not turn out cleanly. Rudy had navigated around him for 5 years with the care you use around something unstable, close enough to function in the same space, far enough to avoid being caught in whatever went wrong. Finding his name on those forms had not surprised Rudy the way it might have surprised a different man. It had the quality of a thing clicking into place, a mechanism completing the motion it had been designed to complete, a key finally finding the lock it was made for. He had spent 3 weekends in the records office after that. He had gone through everything that was accessible without legal process, which was more than most people would have expected, because most people did not know that county property records are public documents, and that the paper trail of maintained neglect is often more thorough than the paper trail of the maintenance itself. What he found was documented and specific in 17 years old and had no clear legal remedy that he could see without a lawyer, which meant without Jerome, which meant telling Jerome, which meant making Jerome stop what he was building and turn backward to face the night that had made him. Rudy had decided not to do that. He tells himself now, lying on the cot in the holding cell, that the decision had been about protecting them. He knows it was also about something else, about not wanting to see the look on Jerome's face when he understood that Rudy had known for 2 years and had said nothing, about not wanting to have that conversation, about the particular cowardice of a man who can face almost anything physical and cannot face certain emotional accountings. He protects and he does not explain. He has known this about himself for a long time. He has not known what to do about it. Jerome came back the following morning as he said he would. He came with Adele. This was unusual. Adele came on weekends and brought steadiness, the particular steadiness of a woman who has spent years managing chronic illness and shift work and the daily demands of keeping other people alive, a steadiness that is not soft but is genuine and runs deep. She did not usually come on weekdays. The fact that she was here on a Wednesday morning meant Jerome had called her the previous evening and told her something that made her decide to be here. They sat across from Rudy at the metal table. Jerome placed a folder on the table. Adele placed her hands in her lap and looked at Rudy in the way she looked at things she was trying to fully understand. Jerome said, "I went back to the county records. I went further than you probably expected anyone to go." Rudy was quiet. Jerome opened the folder. He turned it so Rudy could see the pages inside. Property records, maintenance filings, inspection reports. Rudy recognized them. He had copies of some of them in his box at home behind the motor manuals. Jerome said Carl Pruitt was the property manager for Frank Denholm from 2001 until late 2005. Denholm owned 417 Crane Street. Pruitt signed 3 separate maintenance inspection reports for the electrical system at that address during that period. All 3 reports confirmed that the cited violations had been corrected. He paused. He said none of the work was ever done. I found the original violation citations and the follow-up records. The aluminum wiring was never replaced. What Pruitt signed was paperwork confirming work that did not happen. Adele's hands were still in her lap. The room was very quiet. Jerome looked at Rudy across the table. He said Carl Pruitt signed the forms that allowed that house to keep burning people. He signed them 3 times over 3 years. He signed them and collected his management fee and moved on to the next property. And then the house on Crane Street caught fire on a night in October, and 2 people died in it, and 2 children stood on the sidewalk in their bare feet. He stopped. He said, "You knew this." It was not a question. Rudy looked at the folder on the table. He looked at the pages he had already read in a records room 2 years ago, photographed on his phone, and then printed at the library and stored in a box he kept in the dark. He said yes. Jerome sat very still. Adele made a sound that was not quite a word, something that acknowledged hearing, and also the weight of what had been heard. Rudy said, I found it in 2022, at the county records office. I was there for something unrelated, and I saw the name. Jerome said 2 years ago, yes. Jerome said you knew for 2 years, while I was building a case in San Antonio, while Adele was working double shifts at the hospital. You knew what Pruitt had to do with Crane Street, and you kept it. Rudy said I did. The fluorescent light hummed. Jerome said why. Rudy looked at the table, then he looked up. He said what he said to almost no one, the thing that lived at the center of most of his decisions and almost never came out in the language because he did not have the language for it and had never particularly tried to develop it. He said, because you were building something real, both of you, and I was not going to make you stop and turn around to face a fire that was 19 years old. Not for something I could not give you a clean resolution to. Not for something that would cost you everything you had built just to understand what happened. Jerome was quiet. Rudy said, I got it wrong. I know I got it wrong. I always get it wrong the same way. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Jerome had watched him get it wrong the same way for 19 years. The getting it wrong did not come from indifference. They both knew what it came from. It came from the specific error of a man who believes that protecting people means caring things for them that they never asked him to carry, who confuses shielding with loving and does not understand until too late that the people he is shielding can see the weight even when they cannot see what is underneath it. Adele said, you should have told us. Rudy said yes. Adele said it was ours to know. What happened to our parents is ours to know. Rudy said yes, I know that. She looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger, though there was something adjacent to anger in it. With the expression of a woman who has spent her adult life doing a job that requires her to see people clearly, the whole person, the diagnosis and the history and the thing underneath the thing they are presenting with, and who is seeing the man across the table from her with all of that capacity deployed. She said, I know why you did it. She did not say it was all right. She did not say she understood in the way that understanding means forgiveness. She said she knew why, which was a different and more complicated thing. The three of them sat in the small room. Jerome closed the folder. He said, I need you to tell me everything about the night you went to see Pruitt. Everything, the exact sequence. What was said, what time you left. Every detail you have not already told me, and some you may have told me only partly. Rudy nodded. He told them. He told them about the letter to Jerome's office, the unsigned letter, with its careful implications. He told them about reading it at the kitchen table and knowing from the language and the structure of it, from the specific way it was written, who had written it, because he knew how Pruitt thought, and he knew the way Pruitt made threats, which was always sideways, always with plausible deniability built into the architecture of the threat itself. He told them about driving to Odessa. He told them about the bar on Wheeler Street and the booth in the back and sitting across from Pruitt in the dim light and telling him in specific terms what he thought of him. He said I told him about the forms, about Crane Street. He laughed. He said it was a rental property and nobody put a gun to anybody's head. He said it like it was nothing, like the forms were nothing, like the two people who did not get out of that building were nothing. Jerome said, and then, Rudy said, and then I stood up and walked out. He said I was in my truck by 10:15. There are 3 people I can name who saw me at a gas station on 42 at 10:40. Nobody asked them because nobody was looking for an alibi in a direction that didn't lead back to me. Jerome wrote something. Rudy said I should have told you about going there. I know that. I thought I could handle it and not have it become something you needed to know about. That was the same mistake it always is. Jerome said, did you understand when you went there that it might look the way it looks now? Rudy said I understood there was a risk. I did not think it would come to this. Jerome said, but you went anyway. Rudy said he was reaching toward you. I was not going to let him do that. The 3 of them were quiet for a moment. Adele said, what happened after you left? I don't know, Rudy said. Whatever happened to Carl Pruitt after I left that road, I don't know. I was gone before 11. Something happened after that, and I don't know what it was, and I cannot tell you who did it because I don't know. Jerome closed his notebook. He said 3 people at the gas station on 42. Rudy gave him the names. Jerome wrote them down. He underlined something. He said being there and leaving is an inch from doing it. And you knew nobody in that county was going to look for the inch. Yes, Jerome said. That's why you said nothing. Rudy said, an inch is nothing to a jury that has already decided what I am. The guard knocked on the door. Time. Jerome stood. He gathered his things with the efficient movements of someone who has learned not to waste motion when there is work to be done. Adele stood beside him. At the door, she turned back. She said, we're going to find the 3 people. Rudy said, I know you will. She left. Jerome paused at the threshold. He said without turning fully around, you went there to protect me. Rudy said nothing. Jerome said, that's the whole thing, isn't it? That's the whole 19 years. He went. Rudy sat in the room alone until the guard came to take him back. In the weeks that followed, Jerome built the case the way he built everything from the outside, moving inward, establishing what was solid before he tested what was uncertain. He located 2 of the 3 people Rudy had named at the gas station on 42 within the first 4 days. The third, a man named Harlan Webb, who had moved from Odessa to Beaumont 18 months ago, took another week and a half and a conversation with a private investigator Jerome had used before. All 3 remembered Rudy at the gas station. All 3 could place him there between 10:30 and 10:50 on the night in question. None of them had been contacted by investigators at any point during the preceding 11 months. Jerome submitted the affidavits to the court. The prosecution received them. There was a meeting in the judge's chambers that Rudy was not present for, and that Jerome described afterward as productive in the sense that it established certain parameters for what could and could not be introduced and how. Roy Casper was scheduled to testify on the 8th day of the trial. Rudy sat at the defense table and watched Roy Casper take the stand with the attention of someone who has spent a long time in rooms where people say things about him and has learned to listen not just to what is said but to how it is said, the particular tremor in certain words, the places where a man's certainty and his comfort with that certainty do not quite match. Casper was in his early 60s, weathered in the way of someone who had worked outdoors for most of his life. He was not a man who was comfortable in a suit. He kept adjusting the collar. He answered the prosecution's questions with the flat directness of someone who believes he is telling the truth and wants the room to know it. He stated that he had been driving back from a job site on the night in question. He stated that he had seen a blue pickup truck, which he identified as matching the description of Rudy's vehicle parked at the side of the road, approximately 400 yards from where Carl Pruitt was found. He stated the time as approximately 11 in the evening. He stated that he had thought nothing of it at the time and had only connected it to the incident after hearing about Pruitt's death in the local paper 2 days later. He stated all of this with the confidence of a man who has told the same story enough times that it has become fixed in his memory as a fact rather than as a recollection. Jerome stood up for cross-examination. He started at a distance. He asked Casper about the drive, the route, the job site he was returning from its location relative to where he said he saw the truck the time he had left, the time he would have expected to arrive home. He asked about the road conditions, the available light, the weather that evening. Casper answered each question with the same directness. He had driven that road 100 times. He knew what he saw. Jerome said, Mr. Casper, you described the truck as blue. Casper said, that's right, blue pickup. Jerome moved to the projector. He placed a photograph on the screen. He said, this is a still image from the security camera at Harrington's gas station located approximately 2 miles from the site in question. The timestamp reads 10:47 in the evening. Can you see it clearly? Casper looked at the screen. He said, yes. Jerome said, this truck, the one in the image, is registered to a man named Thomas Greer, who lives in Crane County and works a night shift that requires him to drive this route regularly. We have his employment records and time cards. What color would you say that truck is? Casper looked at the screen. The truck in the image was not blue. In the flat light of the gas station camera, it was clearly a dark gray, a charcoal tone that in dim light or at distance could register as a darker color but was demonstrably not blue. Casper said, could be dark, hard to tell from a camera. Jerome said, Mr. Casper, what was the light condition on the road when you saw the truck? You described, Casper said. It was dark out. Road lights. Jerome said road lights. You were in a moving vehicle. Yes. Jerome said, and the truck was parked. which means you passed it. That's right, Jerome said. So what you observed was a stationary, dark-colored truck at night through a vehicle window while moving at road speed. Casper's jaw worked slightly. Jerome said, "Are you certain, Mr. Casper, that the vehicle you observed that night was definitively Rudy Baines's truck and not one of several similarly sized dark-colored vehicles that travel that route regularly?" The prosecution objected. The judge sustained it in part. But the question had been asked in front of 12 people who were now looking at a photograph of a charcoal gray truck on a screen and a witness who had slowed down in his certainty. Jerome said, "I will rephrase. To your best recollection, given the conditions you described, are you certain of the color you reported?" A pause. Casper said, "I believed it was blue." Jerome said, "Mr. Casper, that is not the same as being certain." Another pause. Longer this time. Casper said, "No, I am not certain." Jerome said, "Thank you." He sat down. He did not look at Rudy. He looked at his notes. He made a mark on the page with his pen and moved to the next item on his list. Rudy sat at the defense table and looked at the wood paneling on the wall and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite the absence of tension, but was the particular sensation of a small piece of the pressure releasing the way a structure under load shifts when one of the forces acting on it changes. Beverly Oakes testified on the 10th day. She was in her late 50s and had the bearing of a woman who had spent decades in difficult rooms and had developed an immunity to the particular discomfort that rooms like this generate in people who are not accustomed to them. She answered questions with precision and without elaboration, not from evasiveness, but from the professional understanding that precision is more useful than volume. Jerome asked her about the 2007 investigation. She confirmed the timeline, the initial filing, the recommendation for further inquiry. She confirmed the outcome. Jerome said, "In your professional observation during the period of follow-up visits to the Baines residence, how would you characterize the guardian's care of the children?" Oakes said, "Consistent, attentive in the practical sense. He learned what the children needed and he provided it without prompting or instruction. He was not a man who expressed things in conventional ways, but care has more than one language, and he was fluent in the languages he used." Jerome said, "What was the primary barrier to adequate medical care for Adele during that period in your professional assessment?" Oakes said, "Access. The county system at that time had significant gaps in continuity of care, particularly for families without stable insurance coverage. The disruption of the fire and the temporary housing period had created gaps in the children's medical records that made consistent treatment difficult. This was not attributable to the guardian. It was attributable to a system that was not designed to handle the situations it was being asked to handle." The prosecution cross-examined. They asked whether incomplete records could indicate negligence. Oakes said incomplete records indicate incomplete records. She said there is a documented difference between a guardian who neglects and a system that fails, and that this case was clearly the latter. She said she had been doing this work long enough to know the difference, and she was certain in this case. She stepped down. In the holding room that evening, Jerome laid out the structure of his closing argument on the table between them. Not the words yet, not the final form, but the architecture of it, the sequence of claims and the evidence supporting each one, and the places where he was going to ask the jury to look at what the evidence actually said rather than what the story they had been given asked them to assume. Rudy looked at the structure. He said, "You're not going to mention Crane Street in the closing." Jerome said, "I am going to mention Pruitt's history with the property. It goes to character and to the complexity of the relationship. But the closing is about reasonable doubt. The closing is about what the evidence shows and what it does not show." Rudy said, "What about what I told you? About why I went there?" Jerome said, "You told me you went to tell him to stop reaching toward me, to leave my career out of whatever he was doing." "Yes." Jerome said, "I believe you. I also cannot prove that in the way a closing argument requires things to be proven. What I can prove is the fingerprint placement, which is explained by your habit of opening the passenger door. What I can prove is that Roy Casper cannot confirm the color of the truck he saw. What I can prove is that you were at a gas station 2 miles from the site at 10:47 with 3 witnesses to confirm it. What I can prove is that the prosecution's case is built on a partial print in a location that has an alternative explanation. A witness who has acknowledged uncertainty and a history that they are asking the jury to read as a character evidence." He paused. He said the standard is reasonable doubt. I am going to give them reasonable doubt. Rudy said, and if it's not enough? Jerome looked at him across the table. He said, it has to be enough. Rudy said, that's not an answer. Jerome said, no, it's not. They sat with that for a moment. Rudy said, I want you to know something. Before the closing, before whatever happens next. Jerome looked at him. Rudy said, I went to Pruitt because he was reaching toward you. That is the only reason. It was not about the house. It was not about your parents. I had carried that for 2 years, and I had decided there was nothing I could do about it that would not cost you more than the carrying did. I went to Pruitt because he was threatening what you had built, and I was not going to allow that. Jerome was very still. Rudy said, I know how that sounds. I know what the prosecutor is going to say about it in his closing. But I need you to know what it actually was before you stand up in that room tomorrow. Jerome said, I know what it was. Rudy said, do you? Jerome said it was the same thing it has always been. You put yourself between me and the thing that could hurt me. You did it without asking if I wanted you to. You did it without explaining what you were doing or why. And then the thing went sideways and you said nothing because you had already calculated that saying nothing was the better protection. Rudy said yes. Jerome said, you've been doing that since I was 9 years old. Rudy said yes. The room was quiet. Jerome said, you are also the reason I became a lawyer. Rudy looked at him. Jerome said, not just because of watching you navigate the system, because of watching you carry things that were not yours to carry alone and not say anything about it. I became a criminal defense lawyer because I wanted to be the person in the room who pushed back when the system decided what someone was before it looked at who they were. But I also became it because I wanted to eventually be able to stand in a room like this one and push back for you specifically. He said it without performance, without the controlled professional voice, in the plain voice of a man saying a thing he has known for a long time and is finally saying out loud. Rudy did not say anything. He was not built for responding to things like that. He did not have the vocabulary and was too old to develop it. But he looked at Jerome across the metal table in the fluorescent light, and something moved through him that he could not have named and did not try to. The guard knocked. Jerome stood. He gathered his briefcase. He paused at the door the way he had been pausing at the door for weeks, as if there is always one more thing to say, and the question is always whether to say it. He said, get some sleep. Rudy said, you too. Jerome went. Rudy lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. He thought about a 9-year-old in a shelter waiting room who had weighed the options available to him with the cold, practical intelligence of someone who had nothing left to lose and had concluded that the stranger with the faded tattoos was the better bet. He thought about a 6-hour drive in a truck that needed new shocks, about calling once a week, about school plays and insurance forms, and the specific grinding work of making a life for 3 people out of what was available when what was available was not much. He thought about a note folded in a box behind a shelf of motor manuals. He thought about the forms Carl Pruitt had signed 3 times over 3 years and the aluminum wiring that had not been replaced and the house that had burned from the inside out and 2 small figures on a sidewalk in the dark. He thought about what Jerome had said, not the professional Jerome, the other one, the one who appeared rarely and briefly and in specific conditions. The one who said things that did not have a legal use, that served no strategic purpose, in an argument that were simply true in the way that the most important things are simply true. I became it because I wanted to eventually be able to stand in a room like this one and push back for you specifically. Rudy put his arm over his eyes. In the darkness behind his arm, he thought about all the things he had not said in 19 years. All the times the word had been close and the armor had been closer. All the ways he had shown what he could not say and had believed in the privately held faith of a man who does not expect language to carry weight, that showing was enough. He did not know if it was enough. He thought it might be. He thought about the morning of the closing argument, about Jerome standing up in front of 12 people in his charcoal suit with his perfect posture, about what it was going to feel like to sit at that table and hear the son he raised make the argument of his life on behalf of a man the room had already decided about. He thought he was probably not going to be able to look at the wood paneling for that part. He thought he was going to have to look at Jerome. He thought about being ready for that. The fluorescent light hummed above him. Outside, somewhere in the building, a door closed. The night continued in the way nights continue in such places, slowly and without variation and without mercy and without the particular consolation of darkness, because the light in the holding cell does not go all the way off. It only dims, and even dimmed, it is enough to see by. Rudy kept his arm over his eyes. He breathed in and out. He thought about the morning. He thought about his son. Jerome Baines stands up on the morning of the closing arguments and does not look at the man behind him. He looks at the jury. He has spent the last 3 nights working on this argument the way he works on everything that matters, which is to say he has written it and torn it apart and written it again and torn that apart too, and finally arrived at something that is not a performance and not a strategy in the conventional sense, but is simply the most honest version of what the evidence shows and what it does not show, and what 12 people are being asked to decide about a man they met 3 weeks ago in a room designed to tell them what to think about him. He does not lead with emotion. He never leads with emotion. Emotion is something that happens to a jury, not something you introduce. You give them the facts in the right order, and you let the feeling arrive on its own, which it will if the facts are real and the order is right. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution has asked you to convict Rudy Baines based on 3 things. A partial fingerprint in a location that has an alternative explanation, testimony from a witness who has acknowledged in this courtroom the limits of his own certainty, and a history that is being presented to you as character evidence, as proof of what a man is capable of based on who he was 20 years ago." He pauses. He says the law does not ask you to decide who Rudy Baines was 20 years ago. It asks you to decide what the evidence shows about what he did or did not do on a specific night in October of this year. That is the only question before you. He walks through it. He walks through the fingerprint and the placement of it on the exterior passenger handle, the handle of the person being let in rather than the person driving, and he explains without sentimentality and without asking the jury to feel anything about it that this placement is consistent with a habit he can document across 19 years of picking up 2 children from school and practice in the library and every other place children need to be picked up from that. Rudy Baines opened the passenger door first and then went around to the driver's side every time without exception, and that the prosecution has offered no explanation for why a man who had just committed a murder would open the passenger door of the victim's truck with the hand that held no weapon in a location that would not give him access to anything useful. He walks through Roy Casper and what Casper saw and what Casper acknowledged he was uncertain about, and he puts the photograph of the charcoal gray truck on the screen again and lets the jury look at it and does not tell them what to think about it, but lets them sit with the distance between what Casper reported and what the camera recorded. He walks through the 3 witnesses at the gas station on Route 42, whose affidavits are in the record, who place Rudy 2 miles from the site at 10:47 in the evening, with a margin that makes the prosecution's timeline impossible to maintain, without the kind of certainty the evidence does not support. Then he stops. He stands in front of 12 people in a courtroom in Odessa, Texas, and he does what he almost never does, which is to say a thing that has no legal utility and serves no evidentiary purpose and is simply true. He says, "I am not objective in this case. I want to be honest about that. The man at the defense table raised me. He raised my sister. He did it without preparation and without support and without anyone in this community giving him the benefit of the doubt, which is the same benefit of the doubt this process is supposed to guarantee, and which I am now asking you to extend to him, not as a courtesy and not because of what he is to me, but because the evidence requires it." He says the standard is not perfection. The standard is not whether Rudy Baines made good decisions or told the whole truth when he should have, or carried things alone that he should have shared. The standard is reasonable doubt. And there is more than reasonable doubt here. There is a gap in the timeline that the prosecution cannot close. There is physical evidence in a location that the prosecution cannot adequately explain. There is a witness who cannot confirm what he said he saw. He pauses one final time. He says Rudy Baines is not a simple man. He is not a perfect one. He has a past, and he has made mistakes, and he carries both of those things with him, the way most people carry their histories imperfectly and not always cleanly. But the question before you is not whether his history is complicated. The question is whether the evidence proves beyond reasonable doubt that he committed this specific act on this specific night. It does not. I'm asking you to follow the evidence to the conclusion it actually supports. He picks up his briefcase. He looks at the jury one final time. He says, "Thank you." He sits down. He does not look at Rudy. Rudy looks at him. He looks at the back of Jerome's head, the set of his shoulders, the way he holds himself in the chair after sitting down still and contained and already moving in his mind to whatever comes next. Rudy looks at all of it and feels something that he has no word for and has never tried to find a word for, and understands sitting at a defense table in a courtroom in the city where he has lived most of his life is not going to be resolved into language now. He looks back at the wood paneling. He breathes. The jury deliberates for 2 days. Rudy sits in the holding cell and waits in the way he has waited for most of the things that have mattered in his life, without visible agitation, without outward sign of the thing happening underneath. He reads the books Jerome brings him. He does the maintenance work the facility allows, which is minimal, but he cleans his space and makes his cot with the precision of a man who believes that caring for a small environment is the only form of control available to him in this one, and that giving it up would be giving up something essential. Jerome visits both evenings during deliberation. He does not pretend that certainty is available. He tells Rudy what he knows, which is that the jury asked to review the fingerprint analysis report on the first afternoon, which is a good sign, and that they asked no questions during the second morning, which could mean several things, and he is not going to speculate about which. Adele comes on the second evening. She brings food from the diner on Route 17, which the guard permits because it is in a sealed container, and it is within the facility's rules about outside food, and because the guard has been watching this family come and go for months and has developed the particular sympathy that develops in people who witness sustained devotion in confined circumstances. She sets the container on the metal table. She says, "Eat something." Rudy opens the container. Eggs scrambled with toast on the side. He looks at it for a moment. He eats. Adele sits across from him and watches in the way she watches, which is with the full attention of a woman who has learned that watching carefully is the most useful thing she can offer most of the time, and that speaking into certain silences makes them worse. After a while, she says, "Whatever happens tomorrow, we are going to be all right." Rudy says, "I know." She says, "All three of us." He says, "I know that too." She looks at him across the table. She says, "You should have told us about Crane Street, about what you found." He says, "Yes." She says, "We are not children anymore. We have not been children for a long time. You do not have to carry things for us." He says, "I know that." She says, "Knowing it and doing something different about it are not the same thing." He says, "No, they are not." She is quiet for a moment. Then she says, "Jerome told me what you said to him about why you went to Pruitt." Rudy does not respond. She says, "I want you to know that I understand what that was. I have understood what most of it was for a long time. The not telling, the carrying, the putting yourself in between. I understand why. I do not think it was right, and I understand why." She pauses. She says, "He used to do the same thing when we were kids. He was 9 years old, and he would figure out when something was wrong, and he would put himself between me and it and not say anything about it. He got that from somewhere." Rudy looks at the food in front of him. He thinks about Jerome at 9 years old in the shelter, standing in the doorway with his hand on Adele's shoulder, positioned between her and the room. He thinks, yes, he did. He finishes the eggs. Adele takes the container and folds the paper towels that came with it and puts everything in the bag with the efficiency of someone who does not believe in waste. She stands up. She puts on her coat. At the door, she stops. She says, "I found something in the garage last week. In the back, in a box." Rudy is still. She says, "All of it. Every semester, every piece of paper from the whole time, folded up and kept." The room is quiet. She says, "You never said anything about any of it." He says, "No." She says, "Why?" He thinks about this. He says, "Because it was yours. You earned it. I was just the one who was there." Her face does something complicated that she controls before it completes itself. She says, "You were not just the one who was there." She goes. Rudy sits in the empty room for a while before the guard comes to take him back. The verdict comes at 11:17 in the morning on the third day. Rudy sits at the defense table and does not move while the foreman stands and reads. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, the jury finds the defendant guilty. The sentence handed down 6 weeks later after pre-sentencing investigation and argument from both sides is 14 months with credit for 11 months already served. The judge notes Rudy's lack of prior convictions in the relevant period, the mitigating circumstances established by the defense, and the absence of direct evidence connecting him to the crime itself. The sentence reflects the obstruction charge and nothing more. Jerome stands beside him when the sentence is read. He does not move when it is read. He absorbs it the way he absorbs everything, by going still, in processing, before responding. And then he turns to Rudy and says, I am going to file an appeal on the obstruction charge. There is an argument about the scope of the non-disclosure, and I have 6 months of work I can do on the timeline and the 3 witnesses. And Rudy says, sit down. Jerome stops. Rudy says, sit down, Jerome. Jerome sits. Rudy looks at him. He says, I was there. I did not disclose it when they asked. I am not going to spend your next 6 months on an appeal for something that happened. Jerome says the charge is not. Rudy says, I know what the charge is. I also know what happened. I went there and I did not tell anyone I went there, and a man was killed after I left and I said nothing. That is what the charge says, and the charge is not wrong about the facts of it. Jerome is quiet. Rudy says, 3 months. Give me 3 months without an appeal. If in 3 months you still want to file it, we will talk about it. But right now, I need you to go back to San Antonio and go back to your caseload and do the work you were building before all of this started. Jerome looks at him. Rudy says, that is what I went to Pruitt for, to keep that work intact. Do not let this be the thing that pulls you away from it for another year. Jerome sits with that for a moment. He says 3 months. Rudy says 3 months. Jerome closes his briefcase. He says, I will be outside when they process you out. We will drive back together and we will have a real meal. And then I will go back to San Antonio and you will do your 3 months. And when you are out, we are going to have a conversation about you not keeping things from us anymore. Rudy says, that sounds right. Jerome says it is not optional. Rudy says, I know. Jerome goes. Rudy is processed and remanded with credit for time served, which means 3 months remaining. He serves them in a facility outside Odessa that is smaller and quieter than where he was held during trial. He does maintenance work in the facility's vehicle bay, which the staff allows because he is qualified and because it keeps him occupied, and because a man who knows how to fix things is useful in a place where many things need fixing. He works, he reads, he calls Jerome once a week, he calls Adele on Sundays. In the 4th week of his 3 months, he sits down at the writing desk in his cell, which is a surface attached to the wall with a metal bracket. Not a desk in any comfortable sense, but a surface that is flat and available. He takes out a piece of paper and a pen. He sits for a while before he writes anything. He has written almost nothing personal in his adult life. Notes on engine work? Yes. Maintenance logs? The folded note in the box behind the motor manuals. A handful of messages to the shop over the years. Nothing that required him to say something he actually meant in language that could be read and held and referred to later. He does not know how to begin, he writes Jerome. He looks at it. He writes, I am not good at this. You know that. I am writing it anyway because there are things I should have said a long time ago, and I ran out of excuses for not saying them when they brought me to trial, and you showed up. He stops. He writes, I went to Pruitt because he was reaching toward your career. That is the only reason I went. Not for Crane Street, though I had thought about Crane Street every day for 2 years. Not for your parents, though I think about them more than you know. I went because he was using me to threaten what you had built, and I was not going to allow that. I want you to know that clearly in writing so that it is something you have. He stops again. He writes, I know I got it wrong. I always get it wrong the same way. I protect and I do not explain. I got that from a long time ago, when explaining things was not something that helped, and staying quiet and dealing with it was the thing that kept everyone safe. I never stopped doing it that way, and I should have. You were not the people I learned it on, and I should not have carried it into how I dealt with you. He writes, I am not sorry for any of it except that part. He writes, you became exactly what you were supposed to become. Both of you, I watched it happen from close enough to see every piece of it, and I want you to know that. I know you found the box. He stops. He writes, that box was not a record of what I did. It was a record of what you did. I kept it because I wanted proof of the distance you covered. You started with nothing and you covered a long distance, and I kept the paper because paper lasts and I did not trust myself to remember all of it clearly, and I wanted to have it right. He writes, I am not sorry for any of the rest. He folds the letter. He addresses it to Jerome Bain's attorney at Law San Antonio. He sends it. Jerome reads it on a Tuesday morning at his desk in San Antonio with his second cup of coffee going cold beside him. The way coffee goes cold when you forget about it, because something else has your full attention. He reads it twice. He sets it on the desk and looks at it for a while. He picks it up and reads it a third time. He folds it and puts it in the inside pocket of his jacket, the pocket closest to his chest. He goes back to work. Adele reads it on Saturday when Jerome drives up from San Antonio, and they sit at the kitchen table in Rudy's house on Millard Street, the house Rudy moved into 8 years ago, when the apartment above the garage stopped making sense. The house that still has the TV tray that was Jerome's desk in the closet and the pull-out couch in the back room that nobody sleeps on, but nobody has gotten rid of. Jerome passes her the letter across the table. She reads it. She sets it down. She says he kept the box because he did not trust himself to remember clearly. Jerome says that's what it says. She looks at the letter. She says that is the most Rudy Bain sentence that has ever been written. Jerome almost smiles. Adele says he thought keeping a record was more reliable than his own memory, for something he was proud of. He did not trust his feelings to be accurate, so he kept the paper. She pauses. She says he has been doing that his whole life, not trusting anything he cannot verify independently. Jerome says yes. She says including us. Jerome looks at her. She says he could not trust that we were going to be all right just by believing it. So he watched, and he kept records, and he checked. Every week for 19 years, Jerome is quiet. She says we are going to have to teach him to trust the thing he cannot put in a box. Jerome says we have time. She says we do. They sit at the kitchen table in the house on Millard Street and drink their coffee and talk about things that have nothing to do with courts or files or the last 14 months. The ordinary things Adele's schedule at the hospital. Jerome's current caseload, a book Jerome has been reading. Something funny that happened on Adele's shift last week. The afternoon moves through the windows the way February afternoons move in Texas, pale and thin and without urgency. Before Jerome files the paperwork to begin the process with the Texas Housing Authority and the State Attorney General's office, he spends 2 weeks making sure what he has is as complete as it can be made without legal process. He has the property records. He has the inspection reports with Pruitt's signatures. He has the county violation citations showing that the work was never done. He has a real estate attorney in Austin who has agreed to review the full file and provide a professional assessment of what the documentation shows. He files on a Monday morning. He files everything he has on Frank Denholm and on the properties Denholm still owns, 14 of them, 3 of which have outstanding code violations that have been marked pending for more than 2 years. He files the documentation on 417 Crane Street and Pruitt's role in the inspection and maintenance cycle. He files the death records and the fire investigation report and the original county inspector's citations. He does not file it for Rudy. He does not file it as part of Rudy's case, which is over, and which he is not going to revisit without Rudy's explicit request, which will not come in the next 3 months, and possibly not after that. He files it because his parents' names were Darnell and Cheryl Monroe, and they died in a building that the paperwork said was safe, and the paperwork was wrong, and nobody had ever been asked to account for that, and it is his job to be the person in the room who asks. The Texas Housing Authority opens a preliminary inquiry within 30 days. The State Attorney General's office sends a representative to Odessa within 60. Frank Denholm retains a lawyer. The process will take years. Jerome knows this. He has no illusions about the speed of institutional accountability or the distance between an open inquiry and a meaningful consequence. But the inquiry is open. The documentation is in the record. Someone with authority to ask questions is now asking them. He drives back to San Antonio and goes back to work. Rudy is released on a Thursday morning in late spring. The facility is outside Odessa, about 12 miles from the city center, and the parking lot is small and flat, and surrounded by flat land in the way that most of the land around Odessa is flat and extends in every direction without apology. The sky is very blue, the kind of blue that comes after a long winter, insistent and clear, the blue of something that has been waiting to be this color and is finally getting to it. He comes through the door carrying a paper bag. He has been in one form of custody or another for 14 months. He does not look dramatically different from when he went in. A little thinner maybe in the way of someone who has been eating institutional food for a year and has lost the particular density that comes from cooking for yourself and deciding what you want when you want it. His hair is slightly longer. The lines in his face are where they were before. He squints in the morning light. Jerome is leaning against his car in the parking lot. He is in the charcoal suit, which means he came from somewhere or is going somewhere that requires it. And Rudy thinks this is probably deliberate, probably Jerome's way of making a point that he is here and he has kept going and the suit still fits and he made it through the last 14 months intact. Adele is beside him. She is in her hospital scrubs. She came directly from a night shift, which means she has been awake for most of the last 16 hours, which means she has driven to this parking lot on no sleep because it was today and she was going to be here today regardless. Rudy stands in the parking lot and looks at them. Nobody runs. Nobody cries. This is not that kind of story. This is a story about people who show up, and showing up is a quiet thing. Most of the time, it is just being in the right place when the moment arrives and the moment is here and they are in it. Jerome walks forward. He holds out his hand. Rudy takes it. He holds it for a moment longer than a handshake. Jerome lets him. Adele says there is a diner on Route 17 that has been there your entire life, and they will have real food, and you need to eat something that did not come out of a cafeteria. Rudy looks at her. He says, that sounds right. They drive in Jerome's car, Rudy in the passenger seat, Adele in the back. Jerome drives the way he does most things, attentively and without wasted motion. They talk about small things on the way there. Adele's hospital, Jerome's caseload. The truck in the garage on Millar Street that Rudy has been thinking about rebuilding, and that has been sitting there accumulating exactly the kind of weighting that is specific to objects their owners intend to return to. Jerome says the inquiry with the housing authority is moving. They have a representative in Odessa now who is specifically assigned to the Denholm properties. Rudy says, how long? Jerome says years probably, but it is moving. Rudy looks out the window at the flat land going by. He thinks about Darnell and Cheryl Monroe, whose names he has known since the morning after the fire when he looked up the family of the children he had left at the sidewalk. He never told Jerome or Adele that. He does not know if he will. He thinks about 417 Crane Street and the forms Carl Pruitt signed and the aluminum wiring and the fact that the paper trail of maintained neglect is often more thorough than the paper trail of the maintenance itself. He thinks about Frank Denholm, who is currently talking to a lawyer in a city somewhere and has not yet been charged with anything and may not be, depending on how the inquiry goes and what the evidence supports and what the Attorney General's office decides it can build a case around. He thinks you do not always get clean resolution. You get the inquiry opened and you get the record established, and sometimes that is what justice looks like from the inside, not a verdict, not a sentence, but a question being asked by someone with authority to ask it. He thinks that will have to be enough for now. He thinks it might be. They park at the diner. They go inside. They sit in a booth by the window, Rudy on one side, Jerome and Adele on the other. A waitress comes and they order. Rudy orders eggs and toast because it is what his body wants after 14 months of cafeteria food, and because it is simple and certain and requires no thought, which is what he wants right now. The food comes. They eat. Outside the window, the Texas highway stretches flat and bright in both directions. The way it has always stretched, the way it will stretch long after all three of them are gone. Indifferent to the particular history of the people who drove along it and the things that happened to them on the way. Rudy eats his eggs. He drinks his coffee. He looks at the two people across the table from him. Jerome is reading something on his phone, something work-related, probably because Jerome is always working and has always been working and started working in the real sense at 9 years old when he calculated the odds in a shelter waiting room and decided to take the better bet. He looks up and catches Rudy looking at him. He puts his phone down. Adele is watching both of them with the steady attention of a woman who has spent her adult life watching for the thing underneath the thing being presented. Rudy says, I got a letter yesterday from the housing authority, a confirmation that the inquiry is officially open. Jerome says, I know. I have one too. Rudy says, I want you to know that I understand what you did with that, with the filing. Jerome is quiet. Rudy says, I am not going to tell you whether to keep going with it or when to stop or what outcome to accept. That is yours, you and Adele. It is your decision about what you want from it and what you are willing to put into it to get there. Jerome says, we know. Rudy says, I just want you to know that I understand what it cost you to do it and what it means. Jerome looks at him. He says, do you want to know why I filed it? Rudy says, I know why. Jerome says, no. I mean the reason underneath the reason. Rudy waits. Jerome says, I filed it because their names were Darnell and Cheryl Monroe, and nobody has said those names in a legal proceeding since the fire investigation closed in 2005. And I am a lawyer, and it is my job to make sure that the names of people who died because of paperwork are said in legal proceedings. He says it the same way he says the things that matter without performance, without the professional voice in the plain register of a man stating something true. Rudy looks at him across the table. He says, that is the right reason. Jerome says, I know. Adele says, both of you stop before one of you says something you will not know how to follow. Jerome looks at her. She says, eat your food. They eat their food. After breakfast, they sit for a while the way people sit in diners when the food is gone and the coffee is still warm, and nobody has decided to leave yet because leaving means returning to the regular shape of things, and the regular shape of things will resume soon enough on its own, and there is no reason to rush it. Rudy looks at his coffee. He says, I am going to try to do it differently. The not telling. I am not making a promise because I am too old to know whether a promise like that is one I can keep. But I am going to try. Adele says, that is enough. Jerome says it is a start. Rudy nods. He drinks his coffee. Outside, the highway runs straight and flat in both directions, and the sky is the particular blue of a spring morning in Texas, and the traffic moves along the road without stopping. Because the road does not stop, and the morning does not stop, and time does not stop for any of the things that happen alongside it, which is both the hardest and the most useful thing about it. Later, when Jerome has driven back to San Antonio and Adele has gone home to sleep, Rudy sits in the garage on Millard Street beside the truck he has been meaning to rebuild. It is a 2004 model, same as the one they took from him as evidence, which they have not returned, and which he does not expect back. This one is older, a project he bought from a man at the shop 3 years ago for not much money because it needed more work than the man wanted to put into it. It needs new shocks, a rebuilt carburetor, work on the exhaust system, and a thorough going over of the electrical, which he is going to do himself and do completely, because he believes that the work you do yourself is the only work you can be certain of. He sits beside it in the garage with the doors open to the spring afternoon. He thinks about the box in the closet. He thinks about the note he wrote at the kitchen table in 2007 when he genuinely believed they were going to take the children, and he had decided what he was willing to do to prevent it. He has kept that note for 17 years. He has not shown it to Jerome or Adele. He has not decided yet whether to show them. He thinks about what Adele said in the holding room. It was ours to know. What happened to our parents is ours to know. He thinks about that. He thinks about the things that are ours to know and the things that we decide to carry for people who we believe cannot carry them yet, and the question of who decides when someone is ready to carry their own weight and whether that decision is ever actually ours to make. He thinks he has been making that decision for other people for most of his adult life. He thinks he has been wrong about it at least as often as he has been right. He picks up the wrench from the toolbox on the floor beside him. He turns it in his hands, the familiar weight of it, the specific gravity of a tool that is made for a purpose and communicates that purpose through the way it sits in your hand. He leans forward and opens the hood of the truck. He looks at the engine. He thinks about the electrical system and the work it needs and how long it will take and what the sequence of the work should be. Because sequence matters with an engine. You do not start in the middle and you do not skip steps. And you do not assume that something is working correctly just because it appears to be. You check everything in order and you do the work in the right sequence, and eventually the thing runs the way it is supposed to run. He starts at the beginning. He works through the afternoon and into the evening. The light in the garage shifts from the pale blue of late afternoon to the amber of early evening, to the dark that comes when the sun is gone and you have been working long enough that you have stopped noticing time. He works by the shop light he rigged to the ceiling years ago, the good one, the one that does not flicker. He thinks about Jerome and Adele at the table in the diner. He thinks about 19 years of phone calls, one every week, no exception. He thinks about a 6-hour drive in a truck that needed new shocks in a parking lot at a university, in the particular light of that afternoon, in the way the campus looked to him. All those buildings and all those people moving between them with the ease of people who have been told their whole lives that places like this are meant for them. He thinks about what he said then. Don't let them shrink you. He thinks about whether he took his own advice. He thinks about the armor and the silence and the carrying and the not explaining and the years of getting it wrong the same way and the letter he wrote in a cell in a facility outside Odessa on a piece of paper with a pen that did not write as smoothly as he would have liked. He thinks I am not sorry for any of it except that part. He thinks this is still true. He works on the engine until the work for the night is done. Then he puts down the wrench. He wipes his hands on the cloth from the toolbox. He stands beside the truck in the open garage and looks out at the street. Millard Street is quiet at this hour. The houses across the way have their lights on the particular warm yellow of houses in the evening. People inside doing the things people do in the evenings, the ordinary things, the things that make up most of a life if you add them all up. He thinks about the house at 417 Crane Street and the way it looked from the street on a night in October when it was burning from the inside out. He thinks about how a building looks when the fire is in the walls, when you cannot see it from outside, but you can see the light in the windows that is wrong too. Orange too alive, the light of something that is consuming rather than illuminating. He thinks about two small figures on the sidewalk. He thinks about what it means to stop your truck for something that is not your problem. He thinks about the specific decision, which was not really a decision, which was more like the absence of the decision, not to stop the simple failure of the mental machinery that tells a person to drive past the thing that is not their problem and go home. He did not decide to stop. He just stopped. He has been stopped ever since. He turns off the shop light. He closes the garage. He goes inside the house on Millard Street and makes himself dinner, something simple, eggs again, because it is what he wants and there is no one to make it for tonight except himself, which is a fact he has made his peace with over many years and which does not trouble him the way it might trouble other men. He eats at the kitchen table. The house is quiet in the specific way of a house that has had people in it recently and is settling back into itself in their absence, the quiet of a lived-in place. He washes his plate. He goes to the hallway closet. He stands in front of it for a moment. Then he opens it. He moves the winter jacket. He moves the motor manuals. He takes down the cardboard box from the shelf and carries it to the kitchen table and sits down. He opens it. The file is there. The CPS records the medical documents, the paper trail of 19 years of keeping two people alive and in the world and moving forward. And in the back cover, folded precisely on its original creases, the note he wrote in 2007 at this same table with a different pen when he believed they were going to take the children away, and he had decided what he was willing to do about it. He takes out the note, he unfolds it, he reads it, then he folds it again. He does not put it back in the file. He puts it in his shirt pocket against his chest. He is going to give it to them, not tonight. When the time is right, when they are all in the same room and the room is the right room. He does not know when that will be. He will know it when it arrives. He puts the box back on the shelf. He puts the motor manuals back. He puts the winter jacket back. He closes the closet. He goes to bed. He lies in the dark and thinks about the morning and the work on the truck and the call he will make to Jerome on Sunday and the one to Adele after that one every week. No exceptions, the same as it has always been and the same as it will be. He thinks about a parking lot in spring, about charcoal gray and scrubs and a paper bag with everything in it, about eggs and real coffee and two people across a table, about a highway running flat and bright in both directions. He closes his eyes. He sleeps. Outside on Millard Street, the night does what nights do, moving through its hours without asking permission, carrying everything in it forward into the morning that is coming, whether anyone is ready for it or not. The morning will come. He will be there when it does. That is the whole of it in the end. That is the thing that does not need a word for it, or a sentence to contain it, or anything more than the simple continued fact of it. He stayed, he will stay, he always will.